Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to be running through how I get set up with Cursor to give me the best, most reliable coding results ever. If you're new here, my name's Alex. I'm the founder of a number of AI edtech companies, which I've scaled both as a solopreneur and taking VC funding. And now I'm absolutely loving using Cursor to build my own AI applications. So please hit that subscribe button and let's jump in, showing where you can access Cursor from and how to get started with it. If you're new to coding and vibe coding, we're going to start off with the real basics, which is downloading Cursor. Now, if you're a little bit more advanced, you can skip ahead in the video to look at how I set up a Cursor project. But if you're just starting out, Cursor is basically a piece of software that you can download onto your desktop for Windows or for Mac, and then it allows you to generate code which you can publish on your local machine and connect up to hosting tools and tools like Supabase for your database and Vercel for actually publishing your project to the web live. Now, in order to get started here, we're just going to go to cursor.com, and I'm on a Mac, but if you're on Windows, you can also download the Windows version. And we're also going to sign up for an account here. Now, Cursor's got some pretty interesting pricing. So it basically has a generous free tier, and it actually gives you a really nice 2-week trial that you can jump into. Now, as I'm going through this, I'm actually on the Pro tier, which is $20 a month, and that gives you 500 free premium requests per month. If you've used image generation software like Midjourney, you'll probably be a little bit familiar with this type of pricing and the concept behind it. So basically, as you code, your credits get used up, you get automatically added onto the fast credits at the beginning of the month, and then when you use those, you have to wait a few minutes for your code changes and your AI generation to go through, which for some people can be a little bit annoying and then cause them to add on more credits to their pricing, more upgrade. But for most people, for playing around on the hobby project, this is really fun and it's a really great way to jump into it. So that being said, once we've downloaded Cursor, we're going to jump over into Cursor itself, and this is what it looks like, a program that sits on your desktop. The advantage of this over browser-based tools like Bolt or Replit is that it's much more powerful, and this is actually a fork of something called VS Code. And again, if you're not familiar with coding, that's probably one of the most commonly used what's called IDE platforms for you to actually write your code in and publish your code to code repositories like GitHub, which you might have heard of. So the first thing we're going to do to get started here is we're just going to create a new project. And how this works is it's actually really simple. All you need to do is click on Open Project, and then I'm going to just have this in my Downloads folder. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this something like Test. And I'm going to hit the Create button, and then I'm going to hit Open. And that basically opens up a completely blank Cursor file. Just going to give you a run through of the actual Cursor platform itself. So at the moment, this might seem a little bit intimidating. It's completely blank. We've got our chat interface on the right-hand side where we can conversationally interact with Cursor and write code in natural language. And Cursor's got a couple of different modes. We've got the agent mode, which predominantly is used for writing new code. We've got the ask mode, where you can ask Cursor questions about your code base. So once we've actually written some code, it will do what's called indexing that code base, and it will then be able to answer any of your questions, such as where can I find the local environment, or where can I find a particular line of code that does something on a website. Or you can jump into manual mode, and that's where you can code and decide what gets added. Now, having used Cursor quite a lot, I tend to stay on agent mode for pretty much anything, and if you want to keep it as simple as possible, I would do that. Now, a couple of cool features here that I'll show you as we go through. This does have web search included now on the latest version of Cursor. You can also upload images, which is absolutely awesome if you're creating front-end assets where you can actually generate a mock-up of a web page. And if you go to websites like Figma, which I'll show you in a second, you can actually download full mock-ups of the type of product that you're looking to build, upload those screenshots into Cursor, and then it will mimic those as it builds them. I want to show you a couple of other things here. So on the left hand side, this is basically where all our files that we create for our project will show up, and this is the folder structure that will then appear in that folder we just created in my downloads folder. If I just click here, we've then also got the ability to search. So this means we can search through our code base and look for any particular files. And we've got this thing called source control. Now, I'll show you this later on in the video, but this is basically where we can publish and manage our code that we create on our local machine and publish this to our GitHub repository and make sure that that is synced. If you're not familiar with GitHub, basically somewhere that you can host your code securely on the web and then connect that up to tools like Vercel, where you can then publish it on your own custom domain and manage it in a little bit more detail. And then finally, we've got things like extensions and the bug finder. And extensions basically extend VS Code and Cursor's ability to interact with different code types or do different things. So a very popular one is something called Docker, which allows you to add something called containers. Now, for this video, that's beyond the scope of what we're going to be diving into. I'm going to do a future video where we get a lot more complicated with the type of code that we're working on. But for now, you can pretty much ignore that when we're getting started. So let's head over into the settings part of Cursor, because this is probably the most important bit. And we're going to go straight over into Cursor settings. Now, this window that appears here, Cursor uses a tabs-based system, and as we create code, you'll see the different files and the different lines of code appear here. And whenever we open anything like settings or any other sections of Cursor, they appear in this tab structure, which we can then scroll through or close. So as you can see here, this is basically showing me my account. I'm on the Pro version here. I can customize the appearance of Cursor. So I'm in dark mode because that's how I like to code, but you can actually change that up. You can change the font, you can change things like how it saves, and you can also activate things like privacy mode, which if you're particularly privacy conscious and don't want your code shared to train Cursor or train any LLMs, then you can keep that just focused and stored locally. For the most part, you can leave this pretty much as it is. I just want to go through the features tab next. So here we can actually customize how our chat and how our agent works. Now, there's a couple of really interesting features that I normally have on here. For the most part, you can keep all of these set to default and not worry about them too much. But I just want to show you a couple of things here. So as we scroll down, you can set your default mode to any of the modes that I mentioned earlier, either the task mode, manual mode, or the agent mode. As I said, I keep mine on agent for the majority of the time. And you can customize this so that as the agent creates code, it will kind of automatically scroll down or change some of the behavior of it. And my advice here is have a play around with it first, come back, read about some of these features, and then you can switch them off and toggle them. But one I really want to draw your attention to is called Enable Auto Run Mode. Now, this used to be called YOLO mode in previous versions of Cursor, and this basically allows the agent to just automatically run all of the tools and generate code without you needing to confirm anything. So basically, if this is switched off, if Cursor creates a new file or it asks to delete a file, it will actually ask you that, and then it will stop, it will pause, and you have to actually do something. If this is switched on, it will basically keep going until it's finished the task in its entirety. Now, if you're pretty happy with this and you're wanting to give it some very specific instructions and you've used Cursor for a while, I would highly recommend switching this on because it's really great. If you're just starting off, I'd actually recommend switching this off, just because as you go through, it allows you to learn what Cursor's doing, review the code, and then understand the steps that it's taking. And if there's something that you don't like, you can always stop it rather than it generating loads and loads of code that isn't quite what you want. I'm not going to go through all of these, but one thing I would say is lots of the toggles here are in beta mode. And so if you're interested in all of the new features, you can add these on, including things like web search. And at the bottom here, you can also see the code base indexing. So once you've actually written some code, we can come back here and we can understand how much of this is actually indexed for our search, and we can resync this if it hasn't synced up all of our code base. The next most important thing here is the models. So one of the advantages of using AI coding tools like Cursor is you can choose any model that you want. Now, in my personal opinion, the Anthropic models like Claude 3.7 Sonnet are probably the best, having used all of them. Google Gemini, also really great. Gemini 2.5 Pro Max, really good. By default, all of these are kind of switched on, and Cursor will select the best model for you and will move between the premium models and the models that are free. Now, you don't need to pay for these models and you don't need to upload your own API key here because these will just come directly out of your Cursor credits. And once you've used all of your premium credits, it will switch over to the Cursor small model, which is a little bit slower, a little bit less good than premium models like Claude 3.7, but will still allow you to code. Now, I'm just going to show you my setup here because I've tried out all of these, and to save you guys some time, Claude 3.7, in my opinion, is the most reliable. It's the best, having used all of these for multiple different projects, including iOS apps. So I basically have these two switched on and everything else switched off. And then I've got my Anthropic API key put in here. If you particularly like using OpenAI, or you particularly like using Google Gemini or Azure or Amazon Bedrock, you can also copy in your API key from there as well if you want. Now, one thing before we actually get started coding here that I just want to dive into is the cursor rules. Now, this is something that often people get and they just dive in and start coding, but these are super useful. So you can actually give cursor what's called global rules, or project specific rules that it then applies to your project. So this is things like how it will actually write the code and some of the principles. Now, if you're not familiar with coding principles or how you write certain coding languages, all of them come with best practices. So for example, if we're thinking about UI design, you might want to follow Google's material design principles in order to create your front end, your UI, in a very specific way. Equally, if you're writing your code in Next.js, there's a lot of good code practices which it should really apply and maintain across all of the code that's written. Now, what I tend to do here is include a cursor rules file in my project, and I will then click on add a new rule, and we could just call it something like cursor rule, and then hit enter. And this creates our first document, which is our rules file here. Now, if I wanted to, I could write manually about the project that we're going to create. So for example, in this test project, we might want to create something like a ChatGPT clone using our OpenAI key, in which case I might write down some details of the project we're working on so that cursor's got context about what we're building. But a really good tip that I just want to share with you is actually jumping over to a website called cursor.directory, which basically has a whole selection of cursor rules that you can copy and apply to your project. So let's say, for example, we know that we're going to be creating a Next.js project. So I can type in Next.js here and hit enter. And then we've got things like TypeScript and Next.js. And if I click on, let's just say this one, for example, we can see that this gives some instructions. You're an expert in TypeScript, Node.js, Next.js app router, and a bunch of other stuff. And it's giving Cursor this guidance around the code style and structure, naming conventions, TypeScript usage, for it to then apply across the entire project. And for consistency, we can just kind of copy this, head back over into Cursor, and then we're just going to paste this in. And of course, we can edit this ourselves if we want to make any additions to that. And then that is all kind of saved as our cursor rule. Now, sticking with rules and other things you might want to add into your project at this stage, one of them is an MCP server. So an MCP is a model context protocol, and you can think of it a little bit like an advanced API and application program interface for LLMs. So if you want your coding tools to be able to access multiple different things, for example, web search, or the ability to communicate with other LLMs or tools like Zapier, then you can actually connect up an MCP server. Now, I'll show you how to do this, but again, if you're just starting out, this might be a little bit advanced, and you can always come back to this later. Now, if we want to add a new global MCP server, we can just click here, and again, it opens our file. This one is a JSON file, and it's called MCP. Now, if we wanted to write our own server, we could actually write that out in Cursor and have it code that MCP server to do whatever we want. But again, neat little hack here is to jump back over to the Cursor directory and look at some of the MCPs here. So you can see at the top, we've got MCPs that can connect to Supabase, connect to GitHub, Upstash, Vercel, and a bunch of others. And if I just jump on view all, there's tons of these out there. So let's just say, for example, we can see the featured ones. Supabase is a great one because Supabase is effectively a database that's very scalable. It's got a very generous free tier that you can then add things like authentication for users signing up to your app. It will also handle any kind of database storage. So for example, if you're building out an app where users might log in, you might want to store their sessions, their authentication, and then anything that they do. So again, we can just look at this, see what it shows, and then we can copy this into our Cursor file. And last thing I just wanted to show you in the settings area is the beta settings. So if you want access to all of the early access features that Cursor puts out, and they update pretty much weekly, you can switch on early access and then use those within the tool itself. So I'm just going to go back to our main Cursor window, and I'm going to show you how to set up this project. So we've got our folder, it's pretty empty at the moment. And what I'd recommend doing at this stage, once you've set things up, is really think about the project that you would like to create. We're set up at the moment for a web app. I'm just going to quickly show you how to set things up for an iOS app using Xcode, as it's a little bit different, but pretty much the same. All I would do is download and install Xcode, and then I would create a new project, and I would select iOS at the top and then app in this selection. And then I click on next, and I would select a name here. So I'm just going to call it test app or something like this. And I've got my organization set up before because I've coded and published apps. If you don't have this, then it will take you on a flow to set this up. And we're going to keep everything as I've got on screen here using Swift, which is the language that iOS apps are written in. And then I'm going to hit next here, and I'm just going to go over to my downloads folder again, so we keep everything together, and hit create. And what this does is it creates a folder again in our downloads, but unlike the folder we created before that was completely empty, what Xcode does is it pre-populates it with a bunch of files that kind of act as the architecture, the structure of our iOS app. And then we can go back to Cursor, and we can click on open folder, and we can click on our test app, and we can see that those files and folders have already been pre-populated when we set it up in Xcode, and click open, and then again we can kind of start coding in here. So I'm just going to go back to my first test web app that we created just to continue showing you this. So what we need to do at this stage is think about what we actually want to create. And a great way to do this is to jump into ChatGPT, or you can use Cursor as well here to ideate the type of website or the type of iOS app you want to build. So I kind of mentioned it earlier, but let's say we want to build a ChatGPT clone here. One of the best ways to do this is to use tools like Vercel and Supabase that I've mentioned earlier, which are free. So Supabase allows you to create a database. Vercel allows you to actually publish your code onto the web. And again, that's got a very generous free tier. And one of the best programming languages to do that with is called Next.js. That basically allows you to create the front end and connect up your web app to your database. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say something like, set up my project in Next.js, connecting to Supabase, and using env.local to securely store my environment details and keys. Now, the reason that I'm writing this in is that one of the big problems with kind of vibe coding and people who are new to coding is that you can write out tons of code immediately, but if you don't have your project set up correctly, a couple of things will happen. So first of all, you can actually get really stuck after creating a huge project when you go to actually deploy your project to Vercel. So to get around that, we might add in something like, for deployment on Vercel, ensure adequate dependencies and versions. The second thing to watch out for here is also security. So lots of people publish apps that they've kind of vibe coded, and they store things like their OpenAI keys or any other kind of secure information locally, and then they publish that to the web. And actually anyone who's got a little bit of coding knowledge can access that through the browser, steal their keys, or hack into their app, which is all badness and it's not secure. So to get around this, one of the key principles of coding is to securely store any kind of what we call environment details, so those things like our API keys, in a file called the environment.local file, and then that is not published to our Git repository. It's not published on the web. But just as a getting started tool here, if you just type this in, it will mean that Cursor will set up your project in such a way that it's focusing on security and it's focusing on keeping those dependencies in line with what will work when you deploy things. So once we've done that, we're on agent mode, and we've got our autocomplete set up. So we're going to hit enter here. So what's happening now is we've hit enter and Cursor is basically setting up our project. So you can see it's pulling in all of this information and it's creating new files, and this is all done instantly. So if I just scroll down, we'll see it's encountering some errors, but it's correcting those itself, and it's actually creating all of the files and functions that we need. So it's looking at Supabase authentication, it's creating this thing called the git ignore, which is the file I mentioned earlier, which means that when your environment details are published to the web, they're not going to be shared, and that's all going to be stored in something like Supabase's edge functions. And then it's also following our best code practices by creating a README to help people understand how to actually use that code base. And then at the end of this, it's given us a summary of what it's doing. So it's basically said it's created a new Next.js project using TypeScript, Tailwind, and ESLint, which are basically some of the coding languages and tools used to create the front end of the website. It's installed our client libraries and dependencies for Supabase. Again, if you're new to coding, that basically just means it's the code that it needs to make calls to Supabase in our database. And it's also created our environment template for references to our keys and some of the configuration bits there. And then Cursor's agent is telling us what we need to do next to continue setting up the project. So it's basically saying that we need to go over to Supabase and set up a new project and create our database. And it's then asking us to add our Supabase project details into our Cursor project here, so that Cursor can then access our Supabase login and our Supabase tables and database. And then it's saying, once we're happy with this and once it's connected up, we can hit run dev, which then starts our development server. I just want to show you a couple of other quick things here. I'm going to go through and show you a full app, both a web app and an iOS app in future videos, but I just very quickly want to show you some of the really cool features behind Cursor. So jump over and upload an image here. So we can actually drag an image into Cursor. This is just something that I downloaded from Figma earlier, which is kind of a ChatGPT style clone interface. This is just a PNG, it's a screenshot, and we might say something like create a page similar to the image that I can use to access different AI functions like in the screenshot. I'm just going to hit enter here, give it just really basic details, and Cursor's going to work behind the scenes to then generate this front end following all the best practice. You can see that Cursor is working away creating this initial page within our web app, and it's analyzed that image, and then it's going to start basically building that out using the front end code using Next.js and Tailwind and TypeScript. So let's just watch it work away in the background. So as it's worked through, because I've got what used to be called YOLO mode on, it's actually fixing any errors as it goes through in this layout, and it will analyze and then basically fix its own errors as it works through. And this is pretty insane, bearing in mind that normally when I used to kind of code web pages, I would actually come and write all of this out. The AI has literally just taken the image and now it's creating all of that code autonomously. So as long as you've got a basic idea of the type of app that you want to create, and you've got a little bit of understanding about coding and security practices and your database structure, which is probably the most kind of complex element of building any app, you can build something out really quickly here too. So as you can see, as it's working through, it's also installing these additional dependencies, which allows us to create more complex layouts within the environment. And then it's finished that initial pass through. So again, it's telling us exactly what it's done. It's even created some icons and a custom logo for us for our app. And then it's giving us some instructions on what we can do. And so I just really want to finish up by showing you two final things. The first is just showing you how to run this on your machine and test it in your browser. And the second is then how we roll back if there's any errors. So Cursor's actually explained how to run this. All we need to do here is just say start dev server, or we can just copy this into our terminal. And I'm going to hit that now. And then we can just copy and paste this into our browser window. And we can view the landing page that it's created and then iterate on this as we like. Now, one final thing I want to show you just to wrap the video up on is that if at any point Cursor goes a little bit out of control, and especially if you've got the automatic update, the YOLO mode activated, sometimes when you're going through this, you might find that it produces errors or it produces things that are just completely not what you want. So at any point you can scroll back up the chat and click on this little button that says restore checkpoint. And what this will do is it will basically reset any of the commands that you've made back to this point. And this is really great, again, if cursor goes slightly out of control, which is one of the issues with these AI tools, where it actually writes code or gives suggestions that aren't exactly what you want. So one of the key principles whenever you're using AI coding tools is to be as specific as you can. And if we were to kind of continue this app, often what we see is we'd ask it to do something, there might be some bugs or errors that come back, and then we can copy and paste in those bugs into Cursor, and it would try and fix those based on the error logs that are provided in our local development server. And then as it kind of iterates through that, you'll finally get to a point where your app is fully functional, and you can then deploy it on GitHub first, and then push that to Vercel to then get it up on the web. Now, in a couple of future videos, I'm going to go through how to actually build out a full web app from start to finish, as well as an iOS app. But hopefully this getting started and quick cursor tips guide was super helpful. Do let me know how you get on in the comments below, and I'll catch you again in the next video. See ya.